Welcome back to the Sustainably Tidy podcast, where I help you get organized in a way that is sustainable for both you and the planet. Thanks for tuning in. Last week, we dropped our launch episode that had 5 starter tips for getting organized. If you haven't already listened to that, I highly recommend you go back and listen because it's actually relevant for today's episode. But the number one tip that I shared was to buy less stuff. And the feedback that I got was that is actually a really challenging tip for some of you guys to implement. And I'll be honest, I wasn't surprised to hear that because it was a challenging tip for me to implement. And for most of my clients, it is also a very challenging tip as well. And so today's episode is really geared toward helping you identify ways and strategies to actually do what I recommended, which is buy less stuff. So let's get into it. The first thing that you've got to do if you actually really want to buy less stuff is assess the situation. I know that sounds very serious, but we actually want to do it because we really need to understand what we are buying, when we are buying it, and where we are spending our money. Understanding those buying habits and spending patterns are really important if we are ever going to break them. So the way that I recommend you create this awareness is by doing a couple things. The first is heading over to the space in your home that gives you anxiety. Is that your closet? Is it your basement? Is it your garage? Is it your bedroom? Is it your office? Think about the space that gives you the most anxiety. And I want you to go to that space. If you're not able to walk to it right now, just envision it. And I want you to take inventory of what is in that space. So for example, if it's your closet that gives you the most anxiety, I want you to take a look around and you'll probably see, I'm guessing, a lot of clothing that's not on hangers or in drawers, but on the floor. You'll probably see shoes that are dispersed throughout the room. You'll probably see accessories that have a home, but they're not living there right now. If you've got kids, you might see toys in there. Closets tend to collect a lot of stuff. So envision whatever that space is, go to whatever that space is that's giving you a lot of anxiety, take inventory of what is in it. Now, the reason this is helpful and important is because a lot of times we don't have the awareness of what exactly is in our space, right? Like, we know that the closet overwhelms us, but we don't recognize or realize that there are so many shoes just sprawled all over this floor. There are so many pieces of clothing that actually don't fit in my closet. There are so many toys that belong in the playroom, but they live here for some reason. So taking inventory of what exactly is in the space that's overwhelming you helps to create that awareness for yourself so that the next time you want to go buy a piece of clothing or a toy or something else that you've identified is in surplus in your space, you'll think twice about purchasing it. So that's the first step that I recommend, is just inventorying what is in your space, and particularly what tends to occupy the spaces that bring you a lot of anxiety or worry or irritation or stress in your home. The second thing that I recommend you do is actually pull down your bank statements. I personally would recommend the last 6 months of bank statements at least. If you are a go-getter, go ahead and do a year, but pull down the last 6 months to 12 months of expenses from your bank and take a look through and see what are you tending to spend your money on outside of your essentials, right? So we're not talking about rent or electricity bills or water bills, but outside of the essentials, what are you spending your money on? How much money are you spending on it every month? And where are you spending that money? And if you can, an even better thing to do is to see when you are spending, right? So do you tend to spend on the weekends? Do you tend to spend at night after work? Or late at night when you're kind of up and you're by yourself and you're kind of bored? And this is important because a lot of times, again, we do not have the awareness of exactly how much we are spending every month on items that we don't actually need. Now, I am not saying you should never buy anything nice for yourself that you don't necessarily need. What I am saying is it's really important to identify and understand how much you have been spending items that are outside outside of those necessities so that you can make adjustments as needed to actually purchase less stuff. So, number one, we have to assess the situation by taking inventory of what is in the spaces that bring us the most anxiety or stress or dislike in our home. And we need to actually get the numbers, get the data, look at our bank statements, and understand how much we are spending, where we are spending it, and when we are spending. Once we identify those patterns and what the current state of our affairs are, then we can do second step, which is take action. So there are two options I tend to give my clients when I'm working with them on buying less stuff. The first one is to go on a buying fast. What do I mean by a buying fast? We are actually going to set an amount of time that we are going to commit to not buying anything except for our essentials. I'm talking about the Amazon purchases, the technology gadgets, the random kitchen appliances that we bought late at night watching that TV ad. You know what you're purchasing that's not in your necessities because we have done the step to assess the situation. Now, this might seem a little extreme to some. However, sometimes we do need to take that extreme step to really signal to ourselves and our minds that we are taking and making a real shift. So let's just say that when you assessed your own situation, you determined that you tend to make purchases weekly, and those purchases tend to be about $400 a month of clothing and shoes and different technology items. If that's my client, I would recommend let's go a month without purchasing any clothes, any shoes, any new technology. And I would set it at a month because they tended to buy things weekly. Now, if you're someone who isn't really a frequent purchaser, but you make big purchases kind of every few months, it might make sense for you to set a buying fast for 6 months, right? So whatever is going to really push you, but also be something that you can actually do in terms of a goal is what I would recommend you set. And you really have to be the judge of that for yourself. But setting a set amount of time and committing to it and saying we are not going to buy any of these items for this set amount of time really can make a big difference for you and making that shift to buying less stuff. Now, if you've heard all that and you're like, yep, that option still isn't for me, not going to happen, can't do it, I've got you. The second option I recommend to clients is to actually cut in half the amount that you are spending over a set amount of time. So let's go back to the example. If you spend $400 a month on average on clothes and shoes and tech, I'd recommend cutting that down to $200 a month. It's really about making progress, building the muscle so that you can continue to exercise it and grow it. And so if you go down to $200 a month, maybe after 6 months, you go down to $100 a month. And then after a few more months, you go down to $50 a month. So it's really about cutting back in a way that is going to work for you, but also does really challenge you. So those are the two options I usually recommend for taking action. I will say that the buying fast tends to stick with folks that I work with the best. And so I really recommend that one. But I also really want you to set a standard for yourself that you can attain and continue to work towards. Now, the third step I recommend after you have started to take action is to reflect regularly. Now, reflection is an important practice in general in life, as many of you probably know, but I think it's especially important here because it's going to help us make long-term change. The first question I recommend you ask yourself is, why was I purchasing the items I was purchasing so often? And sometimes we know what the answer is really clearly, but a lot of times we don't. What I've found in working with people is that a lot of times our buying patterns and our spending habits are really driven by something that maybe we're not aware of. whether that's a fear of not having enough, maybe because we didn't have everything we wanted or needed growing up. It could be fear of not being enough and wanting to try to have some sort of validation, either externally or even internally, by the amount of stuff that we do have. It could be as simple as you just weren't aware, and so now that you have that awareness, you could do better. The second question I recommend you reflect on often is, how are you feeling during this process? Now, I would love to say that you are just going to enjoy it and not have any regrets when you start to buy less stuff. And for some of you, that will likely be the case, and that's great. For others of you, it might be a lot more challenging, and you might feel like you are missing out on something. You might feel restrained in a way you don't want to be restrained. And understanding all of those feelings and emotions are important because they also will help us understand what was driving us to begin with, but it'll also help us to get our emotions out in a positive, healthy way so that we don't get frustrated and then fall back into the same pattern. So reflect regularly. The fourth and final thing I recommend you do as you're on this journey to buy less stuff is to get some accountability. Now, this accountability can come in the form of a person, a therapist, a friend, a family member, a mentor. It could also come in the form of you cutting things off that enable you to purchase more things. Now, I will never get on this podcast and talk to you about things that I have not myself tried and or failed at. This is something that I personally also had to learn in my own sustainability and minimalist journey. I personally love to shop, love to buy stuff. I love to try on new clothes. I love fashion, love buying stuff. So I understand when people say that this is really hard to do and that it requires a lot of work. Sometimes I get it. And so for me, I assessed my own situation and I really saw that I was a big impulse spender. I would go months without really buying anything, but then like every few months I would buy a bunch of stuff that I've been thinking about, that I've been wanting, and something came over me to just go get it that day. And when I thought about and dug into like, okay, why am I doing that? I learned about myself that I had a bit of an entitlement problem. I felt like I worked hard. I should be able to buy what I want. I wasn't trying to buy anything crazy. I should be able to get it. And I'm not saying that we should never treat ourselves or buy ourselves things that we desire that maybe we don't need. What I did learn is that it is important to still have discipline around spending. So yes, I might see an item that I really, really want, and maybe it is really good for me, and maybe it is really even good for the environment, and maybe it will actually really help me to live in a better way. But let's actually sit down and budget for that item over a period of time that works for me. Maybe I adjust my budget in other ways so I can buy that item. Maybe I put away a little bit every month to purchase that item. I learned just because I want something right now doesn't necessarily mean I'm entitled to have it right now. Maybe it's a goal I need to set to purchase it, but actually planning so that I'm not impulse buying and also kind of checking myself on entitlement around purchases was really, really important to my journey of buying less stuff. Now, in terms of the actions I took, I tend to operate in the extremes. So I went on a buying fast. And like I said, I would purchase things every few months. So for me, I went about 2 years without purchasing any new clothing, shoes, extra items. And that worked for me because I really, in my prior way of living was only purchasing things every few months. So during that 2-year time period, I probably would have gone on a binge like 3 or 4 times. And so for me, doing just under a few years was actually very helpful for me to shift my mindset and really make that change for myself. The other thing that I did is I cut up and canceled all of my credit cards. I found as I really reflected and assessed my own situation that I purchased a lot more because I had a credit card, and the credit cards just enabled me to buy more stuff. I didn't feel the pain of money actually like leaving my pocket or my bank account. I absolutely would walk into Target and buy way more stuff because I didn't feel the same level of when I swipe my card, it comes out of my account. Technically, it does because you pay your credit card bill, but it just didn't feel the same for me. And so when I got rid of all of my credit cards, I immediately noticed a difference because anytime I'd swipe my card, the money was coming out of my account directly. It wasn't a delayed thing. So my personality, the way I'm wired, I just needed to cancel them all. And so I did. And it's one of the best decisions I've ever made. And I've been living this long without credit cards, and it has worked really well for me and being more financially disciplined. So those are the two ways that I created accountability for myself. You have to determine how best to create the accountability for you that'll actually work. But hopefully some of those tips, strategies, and things that I personally found to be helpful for me could actually also be helpful for you. So that's our deep dive into buying less stuff. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you feel empowered to go make some changes, buy less stuff. Buying less is a really great thing for your wallet. It's also great for the planet because when we buy less stuff, that means we are using less of the Earth's resources for different stuff, and that also means we are not going to have to dispose of as much stuff. So that means less of an overall impact on the planet. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what you want to hear more of, and I will see you next week on the Sustainably Tidy podcast.